Well, my sense is that anxiety, at least as a clinical entity or a medical idiom, has been increasing over the last decade or so. I think the book is really not about anxiety as a clinical entity. It's not about the biology of anxiety or its treatment. It's really about something much larger, perhaps much more insidious. It's about anxiety as a sociocultural entity. And my sense is that people are concerned about their futures. And in some ways, anxiety culture, as we refer to the construct, is really about our collective worries, whether we live in Hong Kong or Paris or New York. And of course, collective worries, at least in the advanced economies of the world, and particularly perhaps in the American context, is really about the worry about maintaining personal financial viability and ensuring one's socioeconomic success. It's worry about what we are doing to the planet and concerns about climate change and destroying the environment. And ultimately, I suppose it's worry about the existential crisis that's created by the possibility of nuclear conflagration and the kinds of conflicts that we see that could escalate into the kind of conflict that would threaten our very existence globally. But there's no question that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has played a role in escalating concerns about the future, concerns about our capacity as nations and as cultures to respond to these kinds of dislocations. So I do think it's a timely topic, and I think a lot of people are talking about this. And in fact, if you look at the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, you've seen that the number of pages devoted to anxiety as a clinical concern has increased dramatically over the last 20 years. So I think that's an indication that we're seeing much more interest in it. The book really is the result of a series of conversations that have occurred over the last 6 to 7 years that one of my colleagues, Professor Ulrich Heunkes at Kiel University, Germany, and I convened. And during these discussions, which were really oriented about understanding the threats and dangers facing public education and the broader society, what became evident in a series of intellectual salons that we convened and conducted was that anxiety was the common thread that individuals seem to be expressing. And we organized the book around what I like to call the pressing planetary challenges that we face. If you look at those, they include climate change, right. They include technology, population health, and well-being. And the fourth one, immigration and migration. So each one of these challenges that we face as global citizens represents the opportunity for anxiety. And the book is organized not only around those four planetary challenges, but we do have an introductory section which looks at disciplinary perspectives on the problem of anxiety. And there's a closing section to the book that basically tries to provide a coda, if you will, in a synthesis, pulling it all together. Well, I'm not sure the intent of the book was to offer advice. We were largely interested in trying to stimulate or catalyze conversation about how anxiety goes beyond our own individual emotional responses and how this has become cultural in a sense. But I think one can draw their own conclusions about how anxiety is shaping our current human existence And one of the things that I've been talking to young people about, and people in schools and teachers, is this idea of trying to develop more of a human connection with each other. Part of the reason for what I think we're experiencing in our societies has to do with the internet, social media platforms, the isolation that comes, particularly for young people, young adolescents, that comes from utilizing our devices, the comparisons young girls make, for example, with what they see on their social media platforms, and to offer an antidote or a buffer to the kind of anxiety that we're feeling as cultures by getting people to mingle, getting them to connect more in person. This is precisely what happened during COVID. We were isolated. Young people were at home, locked down, not able to interact in person. And I think this has been part of what we've been facing when it comes to anxiety. Well, I don't think there's any question that the last 8 to 10 years in the American context, the politics of division, I don't think there's any question that it's been driving cultural anxiety, if you will. But I think it goes back even further. I have often talked about how in the 1970s, because of the Vietnam War, right, because of Watergate, Americans began to defrock the role of professionals and experts and leadership, in part because of mistrust. And I think to some extent, we've seen a return of that with the results of this election. You have to look at this election, you have to realize that over half of the voters in the United States basically voted for Donald Trump, and one could argue voted against expertise. And my sense is that there will be consequences to this kind of rejection of experts that you would normally see in cabinet appointments by a president. Mm-hmm. So we have a chapter in the book. The chapter was written before the U.S. election. It's a chapter written by Dirk Neighbors and Frank Stengel, both political scientists at Kiel University, German scholars looking from the outside in a chapter that is titled Discourse, Fantasy, and Anxiety in Trump's America. And it goes to the heart of the issues that I think surround a very different outcome than most Americans, many Americans at least, would have expected. And I think there are real questions about, whether we will continue to pursue a Madisonian-like democracy, or whether we'll go in the direction of a more illiberal, autocratic kind of government structure. But I think what we're seeing in part has been fermenting for several decades. And it does have to do, on the political side of this, it does have to do with the failures that we've seen by our leaders to take us in directions that Americans feel would have been the right direction. We've fought for 2 decades as a consequence of 9/11. And there have been other failures along the way, but I think this is very much at the heart of the anxiety that we see in the American people. Mm-hmm. Well, I do applied behavioral scientist. I'm not a psychiatrist, right. And I don't do practicing clinical psychology. I'm also interested in going beyond trying to help people change individually. And I think one of the errors of what we've been pursuing as an approach to a lot of problems in health promotion and disease prevention is the problem of trying to change individual personal psychology, when in fact there are much more structural and environmental and social and political reasons for poor health in many advanced societies, not only the American context. And there's there's another chapter in our book written by Nicholas Freudenberg, who's a distinguished public health specialist, who talks about the anxiogenic elements of how we've organized our societies, and the toll that that is taking on human health. So my sense is that we've got to get beyond a therapeutic culture, sort of the post-Freudian therapeutic culture that we've come entirely too accustomed to thinking will solve the problem. And I think we've got to, as Julie Resch, a negative psychoanalyst, writes in the concluding chapter of our book, about really understanding that positive psychology and the kind of therapeutic intervention that we talk about in psychoanalysis is not always going to solve the problem. We may have to begin to embrace the idea that there is sadness in the world, there is anxiety in the world, and we need to find ways to help each other cope with that, rather than treating it in some way as if we could erase it altogether. Well, I think there are some really interesting dichotomies, at least from my travels in many parts of China, and that of the Western culture. And I always think about the primacy of the individual in the American context. I'm talking about the idea of the exceptionalism of America, but it's really the individualism, the rugged individualism that, and I remember traveling in China over 2 decades ago with a Kellogg Foundation delegation, and we were hosted by Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter for one of the stops along the way of that 5-city tour around China. And we talked about the collective orientation of the Chinese. And I actually think that's a strength, because there are ways to capitalize on that collective orientation towards society in terms of developing social support, finding ways to build community. And those are things that offer buffers to the kinds of dislocations that we find that create anxiety. Yeah, I can't say that I've observed changes, but I'm sure with the kinds of challenges that we face as peoples, whether we're in the United States or whether we are in the People's Republic of China or whether we are in Taiwan, there are clearly tensions about the political future. Right. And my sense is that anxiety is a consequence of that. And I'm not sure if it's going to go away very soon. I'm personally hoping that we can find a way forward that will keep us out of conflict, and that we can find ways to talk about the differences that we view. Well, I think it's going to be a challenge. And I think the internet, access to the internet, the use of social media platforms, is clearly something with which we're going to have to cope, deal with, address. We are finding in the research I've been doing with my Nordic colleagues that not children per se, but adolescent boys and girls are really affected by their use of social media. And we saw this particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Once again, often having just the devices, the only way of connecting to some outer world. And we found that girls in particular are harmed by the use of these devices and by navigating social media platforms. So my sense is that there will be a lot of different things that we will try. There are groups that are trying to limit access to these devices before a certain age, for example. I think that's going to be difficult to enforce, probably. And of course, when you start taking the devices away from young people at a certain age, there are safety concerns because you can't have contact with them if they don't have the device. So there are all these competing arguments about the value of putting these devices into the hands of young people. But my sense is that has been playing into the kinds of problems that we see with young people.
Right.
In the book, we haven't even touched AI. I think that might be for the next one we do. And I think you're right. I think that's a whole another set of concerns that will probably look like the concerns we had 20 years ago, 25 years ago with the internet. The book that we've just done, as I said earlier, is the product of conversations across many different disciplines. And I think the kinds of issues that we're talking about here will require the thinking of these multiple disciplines, because no discipline is going to have the answer. And my sense is if you get groups of experts with certain kinds of disciplinary perspective, you're going to get a richer conversation about the issue. You're going to get a broader, sort of set of possibilities for dealing with the problem. So I think perhaps that's the next iteration. That's where we go on our next effort to build consensus. But the chapters in this book, in a sense, really grew out of something that I think no lone scholar would have been able to do. And it really has to do with the fact that we had different people in the room, different disciplines in the room, talking about the problem of dangers and threats and the overall problem of anxiety.